Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the second event in the Justice Collaboratory's Fall 2021 Policing Conversation Series. The series examines some of the most significant structural barriers to policing reform, and today's event explores the world of policing data. With our guests today, we will discuss what constitutes policing data, how it can be used to gain new insights into policing and public safety, and why accessing it can be so difficult. Joining us today are two highly accomplished scholars with considerable experience in using policing data to advance our understanding of public safety. First, we have Anna Harvey, President and CEO of the Social Science Research Council and Professor of Politics at New York University, where she also serves as an affiliated professor of data science and an affiliated professor of law. She is also the founding director of NYU's Public Safety Lab, which applies the tools of data science and social science to support communities' efforts to improve both equity and efficiency in public safety outcomes. We also have Jonathon Mummolo, Assistant Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and co-founder of the group Research on Policing Reform and Accountability, which seeks to improve quantitative research in policing, especially with respect to quantifying racial bias. Jonathon is also a co-author on an article titled "The Role of Officer Race and Gender in Police-Civilian Interactions in Chicago," published in February of this year in Science magazine, which stands as one of the most remarkable studies on the intersection of race and gender in policing, and which demonstrates to me the immense potential that policing data has for research and policy. Good afternoon, Professors Harvey and Professor Mummolo. Thank you again for joining us today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge.
I want to jump into our conversation today and again, explore the main questions that we've presented in the description for today's event. But I'd like to do so within the context of some of the studies that each of you have participated in, because I think we can only really kind of understand the answers to these questions with a little bit of context. Professor Mummolo, I'll start with you. As I mentioned in your introduction, you worked on this paper that examines the role of race and gender in policing in Chicago and the impact that those metrics have on certain policing outcomes. Can you describe or can you explain the question that you sought to answer in that study, discuss the kind of data that was used in that study, including the methodology you applied to it, and also share your findings briefly?
Sure. So we started with, probably sounds like a pretty basic question, but one that's been, I think, very difficult to answer well, which is if you have, two officers, perhaps hailing from different racial or ethnic backgrounds, identities, or gender identities, and you deploy them to otherwise common situations. So, facing same types of people, behaving in the same ways, in the same settings. Should you expect different policing outcomes from one group versus the other on average? Sort of a baseline question we would want to know if we're thinking about the ability of things like diversifying police forces to change policing outcomes. And diversification is one of the oldest proposed policing reforms for many good reasons. And it turns out that's like a very difficult thing. That's a very difficult comparison to make empirically, given the data that we tend to get on police behavior. Mostly, and this is common across a range of empirical questions we ask about policing, because we're only seeing part of the story here. Like most policing data sets that get released are records of when police take some action. So when they make an arrest or make a stop or use force. And for so many questions that we want to answer, that's not enough. We also need to know about the situations where they could have done those things and chose not to. And then, there are additional difficulties after that, but that's sort of like to even get going, like we need both those data points. So for example, if we want to know if officers from different groups are behaving differently in common settings, right? We can't just know about the times, say, that they make arrests, right? It could be that they get deployed to that setting and they do nothing. And then in a lot of data sets, they wouldn't show up at all. So the approach we took, which involved like several years of open records requests to get different data sets and stitch them together, is to get data on the deployments of police officers at a very micro level. So we know every time officers were deployed, where in the city they were deployed, and when. And then we could basically compare officers who were deployed to those same places and times and make a reasonable assumption that they were basically seeing the same things on their shifts, and then say, well, given that we're holding this context fixed, do we now see divergent behavior? And in fact, we do. We find that within these common places and times, for example, Black officers are much less likely to use force, make stops, make arrests. We see the same thing, though to a lesser magnitude with Hispanic officers. This is all relative to white officers. And then we also see similar results when comparing female officers to male officers. So this is these have been longstanding assertions on the part of advocates of diversification over the years, but at a micro level, that's been a very difficult thing to test. But we do find, at least in this setting, that even when facing the same situations, officers of color, female officers, tend to engage in less enforcement activity relative to their white and male counterparts. So hopefully I think I touched all your questions about the study, but let me know.
Thank you. Professor Harvey, you were involved with, and the Center for the Public Safety Lab at NYU were involved with conducting a pretty expansive analysis of police misconduct, focusing on the NYPD in the I guess, aftermath of the repeal of a pretty restrictive data law that was in place in New York up until recently. Can you please describe again the research question that study sought to answer, the data and the methodology that was used in the study, and then the findings? And for the people in the audience today, I'm going to provide links to both Professor Mummolo's paper as well as Professor Harvey's study on NYPD misconduct.
Sure. Well, actually what we did is a perfect example of what Jonathan just described as, the situation in which we often find ourselves with policing data, which is that it's not sufficient to be able to ask and answer the kinds of questions that, we really want to ask and answer. So, as you said, the New York Civil Liberties Union took the NYPD to court over releasing the officer misconduct complaint data from the Civilian Complaint Review Board. And those are instances of civilians bringing complaints against NYPD officers for a variety of forms of misconduct since like the 1980s to the present. And the NYPD had not wanted to release those records, and the New York Civil Liberties Union got a court to agree that they needed to be released, and then the state legislature passed a law that provided for the release going forward. But the way Jonathan just described policing data, it's not just an officer did something. It's incidents where an officer did something and a civilian filed a complaint. And you're missing all of the, we call it the data generating process that got you to that endpoint. You just see the endpoint. So some of the questions you'd like to be able to ask about the complaint data are, for example, are there officers who, when put in similar circumstances, will behave differently towards citizens, with some officers being more likely to violate policy and engage in misconduct relative to other officers? Like, we'd like to be able to see that and to know that. And that's precisely the foundation of the study that Jonathan and his co-authors did in Chicago, which is they because they had all the deployment data, they were able to isolate unobservables, officers who were deployed to similar beats at similar times, in similar circumstances, and then identify differences in behavior. You don't get that with the NYPD civilian complaint data because you just see the complaints. You don't know for any officer against whom a complaint was filed, what has been their history and where were they deployed and what kinds of situations, at what times, in what months, in what beats. So you can't take two officers, one of whom, for example, has, a lot of complaints filed against him and another of which has few complaints filed against him. You can't compare those and say, oh, well, this officer who has a lot of complaints filed against him is a bad officer. I mean, it's not a good sign, but you're not comparing apples to apples necessarily, because you don't know where those officers have been and what they've been seeing and what they've been doing. They may have been in very different kinds of contexts and facing very different kinds of situations. So, it really would be in everybody's interest, I think, not, including the NYPD, to be able for researchers to have access to that detailed deployment data, officer identified deployment data over time, so that we could then, match it to the complaint data and start to understand, okay, well, who really are the problem officers? It's hard to tell with just the complaint data alone.
Thank you, Professor Harvey. I find that particular study to be really interesting because, again, it's really kind of made possible only by the disclosure of data that, again, up until recently has been not just difficult to get, but legally impossible to get up until the repeal of that restrictive law that precluded its disclosure. Would your study have been possible but for either the NYCLU's lawsuit to get that to get the complaint data, or the repeal of that law, Civil Rights Law 50A in New York State? If not, would the answer have been, would the question presented by that study been answerable in any other way?
Well, it's hard to know the counterfactual, right? Jonathan, the Invisible Institute complaint data that Bokar and I think Roman worked on, did they get that through FOIA data?
So they used a variety of methods. And so for those of you who don't know, Bokar Ba, who's an economist and now at Duke, and Roman Rivera, who's an econ PhD student at Columbia, two co-authors on the piece that I just discussed, and are just incredible at getting hard to get police data. So they've gotten some complaint data, I believe, through FOIA. They've certainly gotten data on officers through FOIA, just officers in general. But they also have worked with a group called the Invisible Institute, which has access to attorneys, and they basically help guide attorneys in terms of like, okay, I know the following data exists. Here's if you took the department to court to try to get these records, here's precisely what you would need to ask for. And then through that collaborative process, they've been able to get a ton of data to come back. But I suspect we'll talk at some point about roadblocks to getting data when you ask for it. And a common scenario is like you do the legwork to find out what data actually exists. You ask for it, and then the department says no. And they're, if you have a right to the data, they're basically daring you to sue them for the data. Very few researchers have those resources, which is why I find Bokar and Roman's approach so ingenious. They sort of teamed up with a group that was doing this already and combined expertise.
Yeah, so the short answer to your question, Jorge, is, it's probably not in the case of the NYPD data. I mean, it's hard to imagine them being forthcoming with that data in the absence of a successful lawsuit.
I do want to explore the roadblocks because it sounds as if there were considerable roadblocks or potential roadblocks for each of these studies, and I'm sure countless other attempts to study policing. But I want to take a step back and examine the specific kinds of data that each of you handled in your respective studies. Professor Mummolo, can you talk about exactly what kinds of data points were obtained from the Chicago Police Department and kind of the quality of that data, including the way that it was organized, the formatting, and its usability in kind of the first instance in which it was received by the researchers?
Yeah, so it was a long process. So the way this project came about is I was working, so the fourth author on the paper is Dean Knox. We were working together trying to get a bunch of data in Chicago to explore this and related questions. We spent a while doing it. Eventually, we crossed paths with Bokar and Roman, who'd been doing this for even longer and had a lot of data. And then we were sort of able to combine forces and then say, okay, what are we still missing? And then try to get that final piece. But it was basically years of open records requests. The data sets existed in separate databases. So for example, we have data on, first off, we have a roster of officers who worked for Chicago during this period. We know various attributes that they hold through, their the records that were released. So we know that, dates of birth, the hiring dates, salaries, self-identified race, gender, ethnicity, things like that. Some of that involved FOIA requests to agencies that are not outside the police department in the city. So there are like, HR type agencies in cities that keep records on all employees that you could appeal to for these sorts of things if the police department says no. Then we have like data on stops, arrests, and uses of force. These are policing outcomes. They were all separate data sets. So like the NYPD, they released their stop and frisk data as a result of a federal lawsuit in the 2000s. It was one data set that included information on all their stops and included the outcomes right there in the same data. So whether an arrest was made, whether force was used. Chicago keeps all these things separately. So then you have to do the work of cleaning them, standardizing the data sets so that they could all be linked in a meaningful way, and eventually mapped back to a beat and a shift pertaining to that officer. Some other things to note. One piece of the data, I forget which one at the moment, was initially denied, and to get it, Bokar appealed to the state attorney general, who overturned Chicago on their denial of the FOIA request. So just to show you like some of the steps that have to be taken to get these pieces of information. Yeah, so I would say, like a lot of projects, the vast bulk of the effort was data gathering and cleaning. And then, the analysis itself, was refined over about a period of a year. The data collection itself, I think all told, is somewhere around 4 years.
Thank you. Professor Harvey, can you talk about, again, kind of the state of the data as it was when you received it and exactly what it consisted of? It sounds as if it was data that was received perhaps not directly from NYPD itself, but rather from the CCRB. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this was a set of a little over 300,000 NYPD misconduct complaints. And what we wanted to just try to understand some of the patterns in the complaints. And we weren't, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we weren't able to say anything about propensities to engage in misconduct at the level of the individual officer, because we didn't have kind of the denominator, right, of where all the officers were and what they were doing to be able to like think about the numerator of like those officers who were accused of misconduct. So instead, what we did was we used the location of where an incident took place. And the most granular location we're given in the misconduct data is the precinct. So we know, okay, so this happened, and we know the date. So we know this happened in a particular precinct at a particular time. And there are 77 precincts in 8 or 9 transit districts in New York City. So that was so we thought, okay, well, we'll try to understand patterns of misconduct complaints by precinct. So we took the misconduct data and we merged it at the precinct level to a series of things that are available on New York City's open data. So NYPD and New York City have released some data about policing, and so we use those sources of data. One is criminal complaints. So these are reports of crime made in New York City. And you can actually get the complaint data at a more finely grained geographical unit than the precinct, because the smallest unit we had in misconduct data was the precinct. We merged at the precinct level. So we merged the complaint data with data on about 7 million crimes reported between 2006 and 2018 in the precincts and transit districts. And then one of the reasons we wanted to do that is because our thinking was, we wanted to, if you will, give the police the benefit of the doubt, such that in precincts with higher levels of reported crime, we figured there were more likely to be encounters and interactions between police on patrol and civilians, and you would need some kind of an encounter or an interaction in order to even create the situation under which a complaint could arise. So we thought, okay, we would expect to see higher levels of complaints in precincts with higher levels of reported crime simply because there's more interactions happening. And we did find that. But what we also found was that even after residualizing out, right, or taking out the effect, even after accounting for that association, there was still kind of unexplained misconduct happening in a number of precincts. So the second thing we did was we merged census data at the precinct level to the misconduct data. So if we use the 2010 census, and what we found was that excess misconduct that remained after you controlled for, after you took out, if you counted for the levels of reported crime, by month and by precinct, that excess misconduct was correlated with the demographic makeup of precincts, such that precincts with more non-white residents, actually it's more Black and Hispanic residents, had higher levels of this excess misconduct. And the final thing we did was we merged the complaint data with the NYPD's stop and frisk data, which Jonathan alluded to. That data, I think, was also released because of litigation over stop and frisk, and now it's released and it's open, and we could merge that at the precinct level. And we found that the excess misconduct was also associated with stops. So in other words, taking out the pattern of reported crime, you had excess misconduct in some precincts that was associated with more non-white residents and more stops. And those patterns we thought were troubling as a picture of what was happening with NYPD misconduct.
Thank you. It sounds as if, Professor Harvey, with respect to your study, I think the simplest way perhaps to put it is that you really did the best you could with what you had, right? So there are limitations in using CCRB data, which again, doesn't have the precision that other data sets might have, and that kind of force you to use the best sorts of proxies that you can come up with. What would have been the kinds of data that would have kind of enhanced your research even more, right? Especially, if you had kind of a wish list of existing NYPD data that you and your fellow researchers could have used in your analysis, what would that data have been?
Well, I think I think, ideally we would have like, GPS data, right, on where an officer is at every point in time as a starting point. And that data, I don't even know whether the NYPD stores it. Jonathan, you may know. Certainly the cars have the capacity to have GPS locators. There are some place, well, it's actually, I can only think of off the top of my head, which is not actually a very good way to do a literature review. Off the top of my head, I can think of one paper that used car GPS location data. This is a paper by Sarit Weisberg down in Dallas, where it's a really interesting paper because using the GPS locator, she knew where an officer was at any given point in time. And she merged that data with 911 call data. And she knew where the geographic boundaries of the beats were. And she put all this together and she found out that that an officer circulating in a car seems to have a pretty powerful deterrent effect, even without taking any enforcement actions, because when a 911 call would come in from a neighboring precinct and that officer was already occupied, and the officer got pulled out of her original precinct to go answer that call, and you can see that her precinct is left, her beat really is left unattended. Reported crime actually goes up in the period when she's out of the beat. And so that's the kind of, like, we know it's like getting the data, like just the locational data. Sometimes we say we'd like to have deployment data, which is where an officer is at a given time, but we really want to know more than that. We want to know, and Jonathan and I have talked about, we even want to know more than that. We want to know what they see, right? Because a lot of the questions that people want to ask about police are related to whether the actions that officers are taking in a variety of circumstances are justified under some, kind of normative criteria. And we never, or whether there's bias in their actions, whether they're singling out some kinds of individuals for enforcement actions. And those are really, really hard questions to answer if you don't see. So Jonathan and I have talked about, like, we want their cameras to be on all the time, and we want to have access to that data. And we want the car cameras to be on all the time, so we see what they see when they're driving around in their cars. And I mean, that, Jonathan, what am I missing? But that's kind of like the starting point of the police data generating process, is just like when you put police on the street, like, track where they go and what do they see.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think the direction the literature is moving, at least I hope, at least like what we're trying to do is to really just acknowledge these blind spots, and in some cases say, actually, we can't answer the question because of these blind spots. The best we could do is like narrow the range of possible answers, and even doing that's going to take some assumptions, and we should make those assumptions explicit and discuss them. That's all relatively new stuff. Like most of the quantitative work over the decades has just been like, we get some data, we run a regression, and then we interpret it. But if you really think through like all the assumptions you're making when you do something like that, it just reveals, like what Anna's saying, like all the things we're not seeing, and how those might affect how we interpret, whatever we see at the end of that test.
It's, but just to jump on this, I just saw a comment in the chat. Somebody said what police officers do is more important than how many officers are deployed in a given department, which, yes, of course, that's true. But I think the problem is that if you want to understand what they're doing, right, you want to select on the outcome of, they've taken an enforcement action that then somehow there's a record of that enforcement action. You want to see all the times for every officer that they had the choice to not take an enforcement action, and you want to be able to compare across all of the different potential encounters and actions. If you want to be able to, again, to say something meaningful, I think, about what police are doing and what kind of effect they have on outcomes.
So it sounds, it's pretty, I think, evident from both of these studies that setting aside the difficulties of gathering the data and cleaning it up and running your analyses, that the findings of each are incredibly important and have value, not just to not just to researchers, not just to academics who are studying this, but obviously to policymakers, and I would argue very plainly to policing officials themselves. Obviously, the more you know, for example, about the potential spike in crime that may happen, or the spike in calls that may happen when an officer is pulled from their beat, into another beat, that can have pretty significant repercussions or consequences for how you decide to manage your own personnel or respond to calls or staff your beats. I have a two-part question, one part of which is informed by actually some of the questions that are coming into our chat function. The first is, how have kind of police departments responded to the work that you each have done with policing data to kind of yield some of the insights? And that could be applied to the specific studies that you've already discussed, or to other experiences that you've had with respect to other work. And how would you evaluate kind of the performance of in-house analytics groups at police departments? How would you kind of estimate the capability of most police departments to run these kinds of analyses themselves, such that either work like the type of work that you're doing is either very beneficial or duplicative to what they can already do on their own? Professor Mummolo, I'll start with you.
So the second question was about in-house analytics. Can you repeat the first?
Yeah, the first part of the question, so now I'm forgetting it myself.
How have police departments responded to your work, Jonathan?
So, I mean, not too loudly, I would say. Like, for example, I didn't see anything by the city of Chicago after we published that paper. They did contact us later and asked for help analyzing data on another project. That didn't end up working out, but like we didn't take the job, but we talked about it, and I took that as a signal that they must not have thought our article was totally off if if they wanted our help. But yeah, I haven't seen too many. I mean, just in my time doing this, I haven't seen a lot of police departments really be vocal in response to studies. I think not a ton of people read academic studies, and like them giving voice to it would probably amplify it way beyond what it would get on their own, where it's just really social scientists reading it, and maybe sometimes a bit of media coverage. In terms of in-house analytics, this is a question I wonder about a lot myself. I mean, the police departments are very coy about their capabilities, both in terms of what data they have and how they use it. And often it's the case that, they don't really want to say what they're doing with the data. One thing I'll say, though, is that if you have a good research design and a very clear question and you have the right data, I don't think the capabilities of the analysts are really, really problematic. Often in those situations, like the comparisons you're making are relatively simple. The hard work is identifying like situations where those comparisons will be meaningful. And so I certainly think there's room for adopting some of the things we're all doing right now inside police agencies if they're not done already. For example, just this theme that keeps coming up of comparing officers working in common circumstances, we used it to study officer diversity. Could easily be, that framework could be extended to looking at to outlier analyses, where you want to know are officers using force at a really excessive rate relative to their peers? If you don't compare them to peers, and Anna alluded to this with the complaint issue, if you don't compare them to peers working in common circumstances, that's just a very difficult thing to interpret. But certainly a lot of these big agencies have the capability to make those comparisons.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in here. I think from the standpoint of departments, I think many chiefs and their staffs feel like they're, they come in for a lot of criticism. And so inviting researchers in, I think the first responses were just, they're going to they're going to find that we're racially biased, or that we're not contributing to public safety, or they worry about the criticism. But I feel like there are some windows opening up to start to have those conversations. I will say that until just a couple months ago, Art Acevedo was the chairperson of the Major Cities Chiefs Association. And Art had been chief in Houston, which is where I met him, and then he'd moved to Miami. And the Major Cities Chiefs Association is the 70, I think, largest police departments in the country. So they have a conference every year where the chiefs and all their staffs come. And this year the conference will be in Phoenix in February. And so I reached out to Major City Chiefs, and I just said kind of openly, look, there's been a lot of academic research lately that I think could be useful to you. And I was kind of careful to lead with, I think I said maybe like 3 things. And the thing that I led with intentionally was, there has been research suggesting that police deployment can play an important function in promoting public safety, that having visible police patrols does provide this deterrent benefit, which has been shown in a bunch of studies. But then I said, but secondly, there is also a growing number of studies that suggest that the enforcement actions that officers take, particularly for quality of life, nonviolent, victimless misdemeanor offenses, there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that those enforcement actions are either not contributing to public safety, and may in fact even be damaging public safety in terms of increasing the likelihood that people come back. They're saddled with a record and they come back to the criminal justice system. So that the whole kind of theory of broken windows policing is just being undermined by this academic work. And then I think the third thing I said was, and there's also, growing evidence that that bail reform and pretrial release are also not damaging public safety. It's one thing we've been hearing a lot of from police departments is, crime goes up and they point the finger at bail reform. And I said, I think we should have a conversation. And Major City Chief says, that's great. Why don't you put together a panel of researchers and come to our conference and, tell us all about it. So, we're going to do that. And I don't know what the reception will be, but the fact that they invited us down there and I was open about, here's what we're going to say. I think that is the kind of conversation that I think would be productive, and that ideally we'd be having more of those kinds of conversations going forward.
Thank you. I'm seeing a torrent of comments, thankfully, and to those who are watching, please feel free to share your questions or your comments either in the Q&A box or in the chat function. But someone raised what I think is an important consideration, and one, honestly, that I hadn't given too much credence to, which is the notion that aside from the existence of laws that constrict or even outright prohibit the availability of data that's held by police departments and other public safety agencies, that there might even be kind of doubt within those agencies themselves about what they can share or what they're prohibited from sharing. And one thing that brings to mind is this law that I previously mentioned, Civil Rights Law 50A, which up until the last year or so had really kind of effectively prohibited the disclosure of any kind of disciplinary record or any kind of information that could tend toward disciplinary history for a police officer. If you had looked at kind of the text of the law itself, it seemed pretty plain on its face that effectively the disciplinary records of individual police officers could not be disclosed unless there were kind of this very narrow set of circumstances met. But the way the law was applied expanded the scope of that pretty considerably. So it wasn't just, this notion that if I'm a police officer, I have something that is called a disciplinary file, and that is the thing that is protected from disclosure, but rather anything that could be entered into, or anything that could comprise a component of that disciplinary record would then be brought under the blanket of protection, meaning that really you couldn't learn much about anything related to me because, presumably everything can be construed to be a disciplinary record under a broad reading of the statute. Again, that law has since been amended to precisely for the purpose of promoting transparency of policing records, but that agencies themselves may just err frequently on the side of non-disclosure, not because they are intentionally trying to be deceptive or withholding, but rather because the consequences of breaching that law can be pretty severe, and it's easier to deny a freedom of information law request and take the risk that that may be appealed versus disclosing a record that's specifically protected by law, the breach of which could result in some pretty serious consequences for the department. So that's an interesting point that I hadn't considered. Although I will say, I think what is probably more common is what you, Professor Harvey, described, which is either the notion that information or data or research that's conducted using policing data will be used to show something kind of negative or unflattering about a police department or about the police generally, and that there's just a significant amount of reticence among policing officials to share that data precisely for that reason, but that there are opportunities, I think many of them largely unexplored, to demonstrate that these studies don't really necessarily have that kind of an agenda in mind, that it's really just about knowing the answer rather than trying to arrive at a specific answer. It could have been there could have been a finding, for example, in Professor Mummolo's study on gender and race in Chicago, that there hadn't been a significant relationship between the two, or that the findings could have been reversed in some way, or that there could have been some kind of surprising revelation about it, and not just that what we expect to be the case is going to be demonstrated affirmatively in this study, that sometimes the studies themselves can be pretty surprising and can contradict a lot of the conventional wisdom about policing or about public safety generally. So I just wanted to share that point.
Yeah, I'll just to comment on that last part. I'll say, going in, there were plenty of reasons that we might have expected to not see big differences in behavior. The institutional factors that lead to conformity in all types of organizations, could easily mean that, people that come from very diverse backgrounds all end up performing their jobs the same way at the end of the day. So I don't think a lot of these answers are obvious going in.
And just to piggyback on the, police department, maybe certainly what we need is more conversation, I think, with police departments to try to build some trust. And I think what we need is not just release of data. We need departments to be willing to work with researchers to think about how to experiment with their strategies, their tactics. I think, we're all in need of ways to keep communities safe without imposing the kinds of collateral consequences on communities that policing currently imposes. And so experimenting with new ways of doing things with researchers there to evaluate is I think where we need to go. And I think, the research community, I think we need to put more effort into kind of reaching out and trying to build those relationships of trust so we can get to that point.
One of the things that we discussed earlier, again, had to do with trying to fill in the gaps, given the limitations of data that you may be granted access to. There was a question from an audience member about whether kind of the long tradition of police ethnographies can be used as a source to help fill in those gaps effectively, kind of, past studies, past qualitative studies of policing sociological studies could be used to help fill in those gaps. Do either of you have any experience with using that as a source, or are familiar with others who have used that as a source precisely for the purpose of filling in some of those gaps?
You want to go first, or I can go?
You go, because I'm trying to remember somebody's name, and so I just sit here.
Yeah, I mean, so in political science, which is my field, I mean, that's sort of where the study of policing started. There's a book, Varieties of Police Behavior, James Q. Wilson. And he does these like deep qualitative dives in a few different departments and tries to develop some explanations for different policing styles. I think spending time in police agencies and observing police is totally valuable. Like all methods, there are trade-offs. So sort of there's a style of research, I think it was popular in the 70s in criminology, that came to be known as like squad car anthropology, where you ride along with officers and observe what they do, and then try to identify patterns. And you know, the pro there is that you're seeing a lot of things that won't appear in a police report. A lot, you know, some of them very subtle, but could be very important. The con is that you're basically making the assumption that everything you're seeing would have happened had a researcher not been there. And you know, police are very aware that they're being watched by a researcher, so that ends up being a difficult assumption. You know, I tend to cast a wide net. You know, I'll get information anywhere I can. I think the way I think about these different methods is use them for what they're good at. You know, don't use a ride along in a police car to make a sweeping causal inference about an agency. At the same time, you know, if you're doing quantitative analyses, you have to acknowledge that there's all these things that you're not seeing in the data, and caution the reader accordingly.
And that was just enough time for me to remember my name. This is which I should know, because I've been citing him prolifically. So I have this paper on the effect of employment discrimination lawsuits against police departments on crime victimization, where we're looking specifically at race-based employment discrimination lawsuits. And we're looking at reports of crime victimization by both Black and white victims, where we need a victimization survey for that, because that's not on the reported crime data. So we're looking at what respondents say in a survey, have they experienced crime. And the short finding is that suing departments for race-based employment discrimination, so that means discrimination in the hiring and promotion of Black officers, that has this beneficial, it not only increases the proportion of officers who are Black, but it also spills over onto crime victimization. It pretty significantly reduces Black crime victimization. We have a bunch of stories about why we think that is the case. But the reason I bring that up is because the inspiration for that paper was a history of Chicago's police department by Peter Pihas. I think I'm saying his name correctly. Where he chronicles the history of a Black officers group within the Chicago Police Department that in the late 1960s began agitating for within the police department, because these were employed Black officers, for a change in the way that the department policed Black communities. And they said, you know, when residents of these communities call the police, like the police don't come. When they do come, you know, they just arrest the victim. You know, they beat up the victim. You know, like this is not. You know, we need to take crime in Black communities seriously and provide an effective police response. As a result of that, their activism, they started to experience a number of adverse employment actions. Then they sued for employment discrimination, which grew into a broader employment discrimination lawsuit. But they made the connection there in their lawsuit about the way that the department was treating its Black officers and the way it was treating Black civilians, that the two were connected. If you intervene in a department to change one kind of racial discrimination, it might spill over and have positive effects on another kind of racial discrimination. So yes, I think we need to get our information and our stories, and with Jonathan, from as wide a variety of places that we can in order to be able to understand what's going on inside of departments.
One thing I want to add to that is the notion that in terms of what's actually available from police departments themselves about the work that they do, it seems pretty clear to me that to the extent that police departments do track data, they do it for kind of one of two reasons. Either because they have some operational interest in tracking that data. So, for example, HR data, knowing who's on your rolls, what patrols they go on. There's kind of an operational necessity toward tracking that data. And on the other, it's the notion that they track the data that they know they'll be evaluated on. So for decades, basically since the advent of modern policing, we have largely evaluated the performance of police officers and police departments by crime rates, right? So when crime goes down, we attribute that to police departments and give them credit. When crime goes up, we attribute it to the failures of police departments and give them criticism. And so they will track crime rates, in part to knowing that they'll be evaluated on those metrics. To the extent that we'd like them to track other kinds of data, if there isn't an operational benefit to them to tracking that data, and if they're not being evaluated on that data, it seems as if the inducements for them to track that data might be pretty limited. I wonder if either of you have kind of any views on one, what types of data you think you would like for them to track, and two, kind of the best strategies for convincing them to do so. Obviously, we can mandate it, through the enactment of a new law that requires them to track and report data. But I wonder, again, this is jumping on Professor Harvey's earlier comment about kind of the utility of a lot of this research for departments themselves. I wonder if there's a way to kind of convince them that, again, the tracking of data beyond what they currently track does have a benefit for them, either, again, along the metrics of evaluating performance or for some operational purpose.
So how could we convince police to?
Yeah, what would you like for them to track, and how do we convince them to do it?
Well, first off, I'd like them to make use of what they already have in ways that we're figuring out how to use it. I'm pretty sure most major departments have records of where and when they deployed their officers. As we've discussed, there's a number of useful analyses we could do with that, including analyses that any police commander would want to know about, such as whether some officer is just an extreme outlier in terms of enforcement activity in otherwise common circumstances. There's other issues. So now I think more than half of the 18,000 police departments in the country have body-worn cameras now. That happened very quickly. That contains a wealth of information. Almost none of it ever gets viewed. It's extremely expensive to store. It's often deleted after 30 days. It often only gets looked at if there's some sort of complaint that needs investigating. But there's a lot of day-to-day, things going on that I think, commanders would want to know about. So a project I'm working on with a large team, including computer scientists, is how to automate the summarization of the content of that footage. Can we generate automated summaries of what we see in body-worn camera footage using some machine learning techniques, vision analysis, speech analysis, things like that. So I think technology is going to help that to some degree. But the real thing that I think we would want that they don't have, that would be useful for pretty much any question they want, is better data on police encounters. And what I mean by encounter is not just an officer actually engaging a civilian. I mean an officer co-occupying the same space to the point where they have the ability to engage them and they make a decision about whether to do so or not. No one's collecting that. And, it's unrealistic to think that you would collect data on all potential encounters for every officer. But there are things we can do to at least approximate, the volume and character of these encounters. For example, in traffic settings, we often have highway cameras passively collecting data on every passing car. That could make for much improved studies of like fairness in traffic enforcement if we utilize that data rather than only looking at traffic stops. So I think it's going to have to be an ongoing conversation, but I don't think this is a question of researchers having these narrow academic interests and then practitioners not having incentives to want to know answers to the same questions. I think a lot of these questions are interrelated.
I mean, I'll just add that I worry about, I think ultimately the goal of law enforcement should be to help people actually be safe. And I think we don't know much about safety. And so that's why, like the paper with the victimization data, it's about trying to understand when, because most victimizations aren't in fact even reported to the police, particularly victimizations that involve sexual assault or domestic violence. And so I wish we could figure out how to get a better handle on the kinds of violence and lack of safety that's out there, but that isn't even being reported. I also would like to see more, they have it, but I would like to see more attention to police department clearance rates. So this is, forget about the reporting issue. This is a crime has been reported to them. Do they actually identify a perpetrator? Clearance rates are pretty low. And, there's a lot of concern among many of us that police departments are misallocating their resources by deploying a lot of officers to engage in these kind of low-level mass enforcement actions like stops or misdemeanor arrests. But then there's very low clearance rates. There's not enough resources invested in in actually clearing violent and more serious crimes. And so that's certainly something I think should be tracked and made more easily available.
Thank you both. We're reaching the end of our time here. So I want to use this to thank both of you for offering your views, for sharing your experiences with working with policing data and trying to help us identify again some of the obstacles and how they can be overcome. Before we depart for today, though, I wanted to give a plug for what will be the final entry in our webinar series this semester. It will be on Wednesday, December 1st from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The subject will be Civilian Oversight of Policing, the features and limits of current approaches. We'll have 4 guests joining us, including Gabe Davis, the Executive Director of the Cincinnati, Ohio Civilian Complaint Authority, Sergio Perez, the Executive Director of the Orange County, California Office of Independent Review, Regina Jackson, the Chair of the Oakland, California Policing Commission, and Giannina Irlando, the President of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. Until then, thank you so much, Professor Mummolo. Thank you so much, Professor Harvey. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.